In the third section of the Endocrine System chapter, we're going to be looking at how the hypothalamus is the control center for the endocrine system as a mechanism of homeostasis. The hypothalamus-pituitary axis is an important part of understanding how the endocrine system is regulated as part of its homeostatic mechanisms. The hypothalamus is located, obviously, inferior to the thalamus, hence the name, but also it's just superior to the pituitary. The two are connected by a stretch of tissue called the infundibulum, and the pituitary actually has two lobes. There's an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. The posterior lobe is essentially an extension of the hypothalamus itself, while the anterior lobe is the glandular portion, which is responsive to the hypothalamic regulation. That regulation is handled through this set of connections suggested in the picture. It begins with input from the hypothalamus, which is going to receive higher input or sensory input arriving on neurons located in particular nuclei in the hypothalamus. Those neurons are referred to as neurosecretory cells. The cell bodies are very much like other neurons. The axons extend away. The difference, however, is that the axon terminals do not make synaptic connections with targets, but rather they contact the bloodstream directly. And here the bloodstream that they're interacting with is called the primary capillary plexus of the hypophyseal portal system. There's a lot to unpack in that title. The hypophyseal portal system is describing a specialized circulatory connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Now, hypophyseal is the adjective form of the word hypophysis, which is another name for the pituitary gland. The primary capillary plexus is the first network of capillaries in this portal system. A portal system is any situation where we have two capillary beds connected to each other by veins. We'll also see the same sort of thing in the digestive system connecting to the liver. There's a hepatic portal system. There's no relation functionally between these two, but the anatomical structure of capillaries integrated this way, which is unusual. We'll see both here in the hypophyseal system and in the hepatic system in the liver. So I just want to foreshadow that coming in the future. Now, the portal veins that are going from the primary capillary plexus are going to the secondary capillary plexus, which is the capillaries that are in the anterior pituitary. The hormones that are released from the hypothalamus get into the bloodstream of the primary plexus and then just travel to the secondary plexus, where they get into the tissue and interact with receptors on their particular target cells. The hormones that are released here are often referred to as releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones, and they cause the release or inhibition of anterior pituitary functions. This is a list of the hormones from the anterior pituitary. Growth hormone, which we'll be discussing in depth in a later section, obviously is involved in growth. It's stimulated to be released from the anterior pituitary by a hypothalamic hormone called growth hormone releasing hormone, or GHRH. And it is inhibited by growth hormone inhibiting hormone, or GHIH, which also comes from the hypothalamus. Prolactin is responsible for promoting milk production, and thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the release of the thyroid hormones T3 and T4 from the thyroid gland. ACTH is responsible for stimulating
corticosteroids from the adrenal cortex, and follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are both responsible for stimulating reproductive functions in the gonads. We'll be talking about the gonadotropins, FSH and LH, with the reproductive system at the end of the semester. This figure demonstrates the relationship of two of the nuclei in the hypothalamus with the posterior pituitary. The two nuclei, the supraoptic nucleus and the paraventricular nucleus, both contain neurosecretory cells whose axons extend down through the infundibulum into the posterior pituitary. And there they release their hormones into a normal sort of capillary bed to be introduced in circulation throughout the body. Really, the posterior pituitary is just nervous tissue, an extension really of the hypothalamus, where these neurosecretory cells release their contents. In a continuation of the table that showed the pituitary hormones, the last two, which are associated with the posterior pituitary, antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, stimulates water retention. Diuresis means to pass water in the urine, and so antidiuresis is retaining water, and the hormone that does that, ADH, is mostly active overnight when you're asleep and you're not taking in water. That way, by retaining water, the kidneys concentrating urine, and our body stays appropriately hydrated. Oxytocin is responsible for a few different things, but its most important function is stimulating the contractions of the uterine wall during childbirth. It's part of a classic feedback mechanism. When the cervical opening stretches, dilates, that stimulates oxytocin release from the hypothalamus, and it causes contraction of the uterus, pushing the newborn through the cervix and stretching it more, causing more oxytocin release. Now, I want to say something which often gets overlooked. These two hormones here are listed as being from the posterior pituitary, and most sources will describe them as such. But do understand that they're released from the posterior pituitary. They're actually made in the hypothalamus. And they're different from the other hypothalamus hormones that are regulating the anterior pituitary, but they really are hypothalamic hormones. Consider this question. When you feel that you've reached an answer, hit the next button to go into the next slide, which will reveal the correct answer. As was stressed just before the question came up, the posterior pituitary hormones, as they're often referred to, are actually released by neurons from the hypothalamus. The final part of this presentation is going to be considering how the hypothalamic pituitary axis interacts with the various glands in the rest of the body, and how we see the common negative feedback system of homeostasis expressed here, especially considering the negative feedback signal, which is the hormone that's being released in response to the hypothalamic pituitary signal. To start the feedback loop that we're talking about here, let's start by considering when homeostasis comes out of balance. And so the example that we're going to be using is the level of glucocorticoids. Glucocorticoids are hormones that come from the adrenal cortex, and they are meant for controlling metabolic processes. But here we're just talking about what's controlling the regulation of those hormones in the system. So glucocorticoid levels get out of balance, disrupting this homeostatic loop. That imbalance, signaled by the sensors in the system, will stimulate the hypothalamus to release a regulatory hormone, in this case corticotropin-releasing hormone, or CRH. That's going to get into the bloodstream through the hypophyseal portal system and travel a very short distance to where its target cells are found in the anterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary then releases the hormone that's going to target the adrenal cortex, ACTH, which will stimulate the release of glucocorticoids from the appropriate region there. The glucocorticoids will then get into the blood and increase that concentration. As those levels of glucocorticoids increase in the bloodstream again, that negative feedback signal will restore homeostasis, and the corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus stops being released, which will then lead to the end of the release of ACTH from the anterior pituitary, bringing the homeostatic loop to full circle and closing it out. We see this type of regulation in a lot of different systems, and we'll look at one which actually is a little bit more complex later on. Consider this question. When you feel that you've reached an answer, hit the next button to go into the next slide, which will reveal the correct answer. While explaining the hypophyseal portal system, which is how the regulatory hormones from the hypothalamus get to the anterior pituitary, the example of the hepatic portal system was also mentioned, which is how the liver receives blood from the digestive organs, which is used for detoxification. But we'll talk about that portal system with the digestive system, and I just want to set up an understanding of that ahead of time.